Chapter 3. My mom managed not to freak out, which I considered impressive. She invited the president to sit, and he did. She offered him a beverage, and he declined. She stammered only moderately when she spoke, and there were more agents in the house now, swarming around as they made sure we didn't keep any assassins lurking in the pantry or the coat closet. Some of the agents held out what looked like thick metal pens, which they explained allowed them to scan for listening devices. It turned out that we had none, which I probably could have told them, considering that anyone with the means to plant a listening device could not possibly care what my mother and I had to say. We tried not to worry about the fact that there were agents moving throughout the house, and more in the backyard, standing at the ready in case, I don't know, the propane grill decided to attack. In the living room, my mom and I did our best to ignore all this. Next to the president sat an intense-looking woman, with distractingly red nail polish, her coppery hair pulled back tightly and mercilessly clipped into place. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, and she wore a severe pantsuit that looked almost military in its cut. She and her clothes were all sharp lines and hard angles. Her eyes were an unfeeling icy blue. She might have been pretty if she hadn't looked like she ate puppies for breakfast. The president introduced her as Nora Price from the State Department. I had no idea what her job was, but the kind of scary expression that she had made me feel like she would trample anyone who got in the way of her doing it. The president pressed his hands together and leaned forward. "Mr. Reynolds, I apologize that I'm going to have to be somewhat secretive. I've come here to ask if you could be our guest for a few days. I can assure you that you'll be in absolutely no danger." "What?" my mom asked, her voice rising several octaves. Mrs. Price smiled, but it was more the indulgent than warm smile. The kind of smile used only by people who have to work hard at appearing non-threatening. "I can assure you that this is a matter of national security." I was starting to think that illegally downloading those episodes of Teen Wolf might have been a mistake. I knew the commercials told us that piracy was not a victimless crime. Even so, I wanted to believe that the president had other things to worry about. "Why do you need me?" I managed to ask without my voice cracking. "That's classified," Mrs. Price said, not kindly. She seemed to have forgotten to appear non-threatening. "It needs to be unclassified," my mother said, "or I'm not agreeing to anything. These agents say he isn't in trouble." "And he isn't," the president assured her, taking a much warmer tone than the State Department woman. "All I can tell you is that there's a visiting representative of, shall we say, a foreign government, who has requested the honor of meeting Ezekiel. I can't say anything more, so I understand your frustration. I have 2 daughters myself, and I can imagine I wouldn't much care for it if someone came to me and proposed what I'm proposing to you. I can only give you my word, as your president and as a father, that your son will not be in any harm's way, and that he'll be doing a great service to his country." "How long are we talking about?" my mother asked. "Initially 2 days," the president said. "It may happen that Zeke will choose to participate in a sort of foreign exchange program, and if that's the case, it will be longer. At that point, you would receive more information." "What sort of exchange program?" she demanded. "With what country? Wait, let me guess, you can't tell me." The president smiled, and it was genuine. I had the feeling that he'd already come to like my mother, as if, under other circumstances, the 2 of them could have hung out, gone bowling or whatever. "The only thing I can add is that it will be a unique experience," he told her. "I do feel very confident that your son will not regret coming with us." I looked at the president. "Does it have to be me, or will some other kid work, sir?" "It has to be you," the president assured me. "Why would some ambassador even know who I am? Is this about my father's show?" American shows, even unsuccessful ones, can develop followings in foreign countries. For some reason that remained unclear to me, they went wild for Colony Alpha in Estonia. "The father," Mrs. Price explained to the president, "now deceased, created an unpopular television program." Now there's a way to honor a man's life. It has nothing to do with that," the president said. "As to why it has to be you, I'm afraid I can't tell you at this time." My mother took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, a sure sign she was about to say something that made her uncomfortable. I'm sorry, but the answer is no. I'm not letting you take my son unless you give me more information. We don't actually have to ask you, Mrs. Price said. She sat up straight, and the hard look she gave my mother was nothing short of a challenge. This is national security, and as such we can take him whether you like it or not. If you attempt to interfere, we can arrest you. We don't want to play that way. The president held up his hand to silence her. And we won't. Zeke is not going to be taken against his will, and no one is going to be arrested. So I can say no? Asked my mother. My plan, the president said, is to stay here until I can convince you to say yes. I couldn't imagine why any ambassador would want to meet me. But I also couldn't imagine going the rest of my life without finding out. How would I feel years from now, when I remembered the time the president came asking for my help and I sent him away? It seemed to me that this might be the situation I could use to my mother's advantage, though. If I could help her and find out why my government needed me, then everyone would be a winner. The thing is, I said, if I were to go, it would be really hard on my mom, and that isn't good for her to be under stress. The president nodded gravely. Yes, we are aware of her health issues. My mother started at this. That's none of the government's business. How exactly did my private healthcare records... Mrs. Price cut her off. National security. I spoke up before my mother decided to see what it would happen if she gouged the eyes out of someone in the president's entourage. Are you aware, I asked, that her insurance company has been giving her a hard time about the treatments her doctor wants her to get? Ezekiel! My mother snapped. Maybe she thought this was no one else's business, or maybe she had an inkling of what I had in mind. Either way, she was unhappy. The president raised his eyebrows like he was mildly amused. Go on. He was going to make me say it. I was wondering if you might be able to smooth some things over, being, the president and all. It would make me feel better to know my mom was getting the care her doctor prescribed. The president frowned, deep in serious thought. There was maybe a hint of the side you didn't want to see. After a moment's thought, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone and pressed one button. A Mrs. Reynolds is going to be calling your office tomorrow. Have one of your people take her information and make certain her insurance company understands that you want her to receive any treatment her doctor recommends. The president then looked at my mother. That was the Secretary of Health and Human Services. He was typing into his phone as he spoke. I'm sending a note to my assistant right now to provide you with her direct number. You can call her, and you'll have everything you need. My mother looked at him, and she looked at me. Thank you, she said quietly. Now, the president said, meeting my eye, are you done playing hardball with the leader of the free world? I haven't agreed to anything, my mother reminded him. Come on, Mom, I said. He said I'd be in no danger. No danger whatsoever, the president assured her. I knew what she was thinking. She was wondering if she would have been so reluctant if she hadn't been sick, and if that was what would tip her over to my side. She hated the thought of what her illness would do to me, the kind of responsibilities that would come my way, the experiences I might miss. You're sure you want to go? She asked. I don't know what this is about, but I have to admit I'm really curious. She gave the slightest of nods. And because I am always thinking ahead, I turned to the severe woman, Mrs. Price, and said, I'll also need a note excusing my absence from school. Can I get that on White House stationery? I quickly packed a small bag with enough clothes for 2 days. My mother hugged me several times and told me to call her if I got scared or needed to come home. I hated to leave her, and I was already plenty scared, but every time I thought about pulling the plug, my curiosity kicked in. Why, of all people in the country, did I have to speak to some foreign bigwig? How could it possibly be so important that the President of the United States would drive 2 hours to Wilmington to press his case? I had to know what this was about. I did not get to ride with the President, but he stopped me before I got into the back seat of a sedan, and shook my hand and thanked me for being willing to serve my country. I appreciate that, sir, I said, trying to act like I was not flipping out. I think you'll find it interesting, he said. And Ezekiel, for the record, I respect how you stood up for your mother's interests. I know that all of this, he waved his hands at the sedans and agents, must be very intimidating. You've got a lot of courage, young man. Thank you, sir, I said, feeling like a phony. I was sure if the president had seen me cringing as Tanner Hughes smacked me around, he'd have found some other clueless kid to meet with his ambassador of wherever. I rode with Agent Jimez and McTeague, who were polite but not particularly conversational. As we pulled onto the highway and headed towards D.C., I finally worked up the nerve to speak. Do you guys know what's going on? Jimez shrugged. I'm not authorized to answer that. You're not authorized to tell me whether or not you know. I'm not even authorized to explain what I initially meant. How about you, McTeague? I asked the agent riding shotgun. I'm not authorized even to discuss my level of authorization, he said without turning around. Is there anything you can tell me? I'm not authorized to answer any questions about what I can or cannot answer, Agent Jimez says. Except, he began, and then he just shook his head. Wow. That's all I'm gonna say. Wow. Then he cast a look at McTeague, and the two of them burst out laughing.